Investigative reporting, where journalists dig and dig and dig to uncover the facts organizations or individuals would keep secret, can be very expensive. In fact, with newspaper subscriptions way down and advertising dollars substantially diminished, many newspapers can no longer afford to foot the bill for these watchdog stories. And even when thorough, fact-based investigations are finally published, they can sometimes be easily ignored and occasionally disappear with little outrage. Some experts are saying this cocktail presents a potential crisis for our democracy.
In democracy, we delegate a lot of decisions. Voters delegate to representatives, representatives delegate to regulators, and there's a lot of things that we don't know. How are those relationships operating? So I entitled the book Democracy's Detectives because I wanted to say there are a set of stories that are costly because, to be frank, when people are making decisions, they don't advertise when they go against the wishes of voters or the wishes of Congress members necessarily. So there are these tough stories about how democracy really works.
That's James Hamilton, Hearst Professor of Communication at Stanford University and author of Democracy's Detectives: The Economics of Investigative Journalism.
Investigative reporting is original work about something of substantive interest to the community that someone is trying to keep secret. They've modified the definition slightly to also include or is hiding in plain sight, because what you find in investigations, most of them, there's an institution that's gone awry. There is a problem with the delegation of decision-making or authority.
The iconic example of investigative reporting most people think of is the Watergate story by Bob Woodward and Bernstein of the Washington Post. But Hamilton says investigative reporting existed long before then. He gives an early example of investigative reporting that uncovered a serious public health hazard back in the 1850s in New York City.
The spoiled milk investigation from the 1850s, it was interesting in that milk wasn't heavily regulated back then in terms of safety, and you had a newspaper, a magazine actually, that took the time to look at how the cows were being raised, what they were drinking, and also where the milk was going. And there was consumer fraud involved. And what was interesting about it was that it really was deep digging. You had people who were watching the milk wagons go away from the places where the cows had been drinking feed that was the slop that was produced from alcohol generation. The milk was unhealthy for children and were causing, in some cases, deaths.
Hamilton says the impact of investigative journalism done correctly can spread far and wide.
Sometimes when you tell the story of an institution that's not operating well, you're going to generate public debate, or you're going to generate more investigations by the government. So that would be a deliberative response. Sometimes you get an individual response. There's a bad actor that's identified. That person might be fired. They might go to jail. Or sometimes when you tell the tale of injustice, somebody who shouldn't be in jail is released. And then finally, you also can see substantive change. That might be a change in a regulation or even a change in a law.
But these potentially massive watchdog stories usually don't come cheap.
Probably one of the biggest costs is time. And the average investigation takes about 6 months. Let's look at one at a McClatchy paper at the Raleigh News and Observer. It was a story about the operation of the North Carolina parole system and probation system. That story cost about $200,000 because you had multiple reporters and editors, you had some legal fees, you had some public document fees. If you look at other major Pulitzer stories, they might cost $500,000. So it's really the time of the people involved, the large numbers in major investigations. You may have a data journalist, a researcher, several reporters, a multimedia editor. And then there's a lot of hassle cost when you are trying to pull things out of the government. That could involve Freedom of Information Act requests. It could even involve litigation.
One way to mitigate the costs of investigative reporting is to rely on what Hamilton calls computational reporting.
Even though economists are often dour, I'm hopeful that we will be able to lower the cost of discovering stories with better use of data and algorithms, and in that way figure out how institutions are operating.
Hamilton says one example of computational journalism was a famous story about doctors who abuse their patients, written by Danny Robbins for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
The websites of all 50 medical societies in the United States got 100,000 cases where it looked like a doctor might be involved in sexual harassment or abuse and still be practicing. And they wrote a machine learning model to reduce those 100,000 cases to 6,000 likely cases. And then they read all of them and they got a wonderful story that was a Pulitzer finalist.
However, Hamilton says that as time passes, fewer and fewer investigative stories are being told.
The demand for those stories are there. Unfortunately, in the book, what I show is that if you look at the major prize competitions for investigative reporting, they're increasingly being won by the larger national organizations like the New York Times or the Washington Post, because we're in a world where newsrooms at newspapers have probably gone from 55,000 to 22,000 since the financial collapse. So fewer people, fewer stories, more probably. Paul Starr, a professor at Princeton, says we're basically running an experiment in corruption, especially at the local level. Right now, I think there are a lot of important local stories that are going untold and uncovered.
Hamilton says investigative journalism is critical to preserving a free society. He quotes Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Pat Stiff.
He says, when we're doing our jobs, we defend the weak against the powerful. We work for racial, sexual, and religious tolerance. We expose corruption and wrongdoing wherever we find it. We support public education. We protect the environment. We promote the arts. We side with working men and women when they're exposed to dangerous working conditions, and good newspapers police the government.
If you value investigative journalism, Hamilton says one basic and necessary step is to give it your financial support and not simply rely on free stories published online.
Information is a public good. We can consume it even if we didn't pay for it. My consumption doesn't prevent you from consuming it even. Public goods are underprovided. So if people care about this, if they're listening, subscribe to something that pays a journalist or donate to something that can be nonprofit media. So the fault is not in our stars, it's in ourselves. If people really care about it, they should support it.
You can learn more about our guest, James Hamilton, and his book, Democracy's Detectives, by visiting our website at viewpointsonline.net. You can find archives of past programs there and on iTunes and Stitcher. Our writer-producer for this segment is Polly Henson. I'm Gary Price.
Been looking for the perfect holiday gift for that coffee or latte lover in your life? Make it a special one with the Keurig K-Latte single-serve coffee and latte maker, available exclusively at Walmart for only $99. The new Keurig K-Latte single-serve coffee and latte maker allows coffee lovers to enjoy regular single-serve coffee or lattes in the comfort of their own home. Use any K-Cup pod to brew coffee or make delicious lattes. While most specialty coffee makers can be complicated, time-consuming, and messy, the Keurig K-Latte Coffee House Brewer is simple to use, allowing consumers to prepare coffee or lattes in minutes. Swing by your local Walmart or find the K-Latte Coffee House Brewer at walmart.com for the everyday low price of $99 and give the gift of a more delicious holiday.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook to learn about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on iTunes. Plus, you'll always find podcasts of our segments and information about our guests at viewpointsonline.net. Join us again next week for your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.